The fog had just begun to roll in over the English countryside, curling like pale fingers through the skeletal branches of the elms near the estate of Black Hollow Manor. The year was 1798, a time when England was teetering between Enlightenment and ancient superstition, where science battled with folklore, and graves still held more mystery than truth. At the heart of this tale is Eliza Harrow, a 14-year-old girl whose life was neither noble nor famous, yet whose fate would leave a scar on the land and whisper through generations. She was the only daughter of Jonathan Harrow, a reserved but respected local doctor in the county of Wiltshire. Their modest stone house sat near the village of Caldwell, a place that barely existed on maps and seemed to vanish into the hills when the mist thickened. Eliza was quiet, curious, and drawn to the world like it was a puzzle meant just for her. She read everything in her father's collection: anatomy charts, field journals, and even botanical texts in Latin. But that winter her hands had started to tremble. Her skin became pale, and she often woke from fevered dreams with blood on her lips. Physicians from neighboring towns were summoned. They wore coats soaked with the scent of pipe smoke and tinctures, and they peered over her as though she were a specimen. One declared it was consumption. Another said hysteria. None could stop the wasting that slowly pulled her from the world. Then one morning, still and gray, she stopped breathing. Her mother screamed first. Then silence. A heavy, solemn kind. The kind that blankets rooms before the earth is ever disturbed. She was declared dead by her own father, the village's most learned man, who checked her pulse and placed his ear against her chest with trembling hands. There was nothing. Just stillness. She was gone. Or so they believed. The burial that came too soon. In the 18th century, fear of premature burial wasn't just superstition. It was reality. The Lazarus syndrome, they called it in hushed tones. With limited tools, shallow breaths and weak pulses often deceived even the most skilled doctors. And in cold winter months, families buried their dead quickly, before rot, before rats, before ruin. Eliza's body was dressed in her favorite blue gown, faded silk with tiny embroidered violets, and placed in a pinewood coffin. Her hair was brushed, and her mother placed a small locket around her neck, one that had belonged to Eliza's grandmother. Inside was a tiny portrait, hand-painted, of her as a baby, sleeping in her mother's arms. The villagers gathered at Hollow Hill Cemetery, where the Harrow family plot sat beneath a crooked yew tree. The sky was colorless. A single crow watched from a mossy tombstone as the earth swallowed the box containing Eliza Harrow. They buried her at dusk. And by dawn she was awake. Muffled screams in the dirt. No one truly knows when she awoke. But evidence, decades later, suggested it may have been just hours after burial. Some say the cold slowed her heart. Others whisper that she was in a coma, her breath too soft to be heard through winter air. But sometime in the darkness, Eliza opened her eyes. Silence. Then panic. Her fingers scraped the inside of the lid. The splinters embedded into her skin told stories no words ever could. She screamed until her throat bled, fists slamming against the wood in desperation. Her nails broke off in pieces, leaving behind gouges in the pine that would one day be found, silent, eternal testimony. There was no one to hear her, no one to save her. The coffin held. The earth did not yield. She died there, not of illness, not of God's will, but of fear, of suffocation, of abandonment. When the grave was eventually opened, nearly a year later during a routine reburial of the Harrow plot, the discovery froze the workers in place. Her body had shifted. The burial shroud was torn from within. Her hands were raised, clutching her face. And the lid bore the marks of madness. A village cursed by its silence. The news spread like rot. First through whispers, then through sermons, then through fear. Black Hollow Manor was abandoned within months. Villagers claimed to hear scratching in the walls, low moans at night, and saw figures near the graveyard that vanished in the fog. Some called it guilt. Others said it was a curse. Dr. Harrow, the man who had declared his daughter dead, disappeared not long after the reburial. His last letter, addressed to no one, simply read, "She blinked. I know she did. But I didn't believe it." The church bell was taken down. The yew tree under which Eliza was buried was struck by lightning during a storm in 1802. It split directly down the middle. Half dead, half alive. And the town of Caldwell? Gone. Vanished from every record after 1811. Only fragments remain, a map in a museum, a single gravestone behind an overgrown fence, and this tale, whispered from teacher to student, from traveler to traveler. The girl who died twice. The girl who was buried alive. The mistake that haunted a kingdom. The silence in the palace was misleading. It wasn't peace but tension bottled up and waiting to burst. After Princess Elira's burial, a heavy air settled over the stone corridors of the royal palace. Her mother, Queen Verrell, had withdrawn completely. She no longer attended court, no longer smiled at the staff, and no longer visited the royal chapel where Elira's body now lay in the royal crypt, sealed behind marble walls. But what no one outside the palace gates knew was this. Strange whispers had begun to ripple through the servants' quarters. Elira's maid, a quiet girl named Maris, had vanished shortly after the funeral. And 2 night guards reported hearing faint tapping noises from the direction of the crypt. But when they mentioned it, they were quietly reassigned to posts outside the city. The official story was grief. The real story was fear. The rumor that started it all. The first servant to truly speak up was an elderly washerwoman named Brayla. She had worked in the palace for 4 decades and had little interest in court gossip. But one morning she approached the royal steward with trembling hands and whispered, "The young princess, I swear on the gods her ghost cries at night." She claimed she had heard weeping echoing from the lower halls, near the royal crypt, between the hours of midnight and dawn. Others began to nod along. A cook's boy claimed he heard scratching. A maid said she saw a shadow that didn't belong. The steward brushed it off at first. "Ghosts are for poets and drunks," he'd scoffed. But Brayla wasn't done. She'd seen the coffin before it was lowered into the crypt. She remembered something strange. The girl's mouth had been open as if gasping. Her fingers were curled, not relaxed in death, but as if frozen mid-clutch. The steward's face had gone pale. But he said nothing. He couldn't. Because the burial had been rushed, suspiciously so. The physician's silence. Elira's official cause of death was fever. A mysterious illness that came suddenly, left her unconscious, and ended her life within 2 days. But now more details began to surface. The palace physician, Master Edric, had initially protested the burial. He had said the girl's condition might have been a form of coma. Shallow breathing, unresponsive, but not death. He had wanted more time. A few more days of observation. Perhaps even to bring in a monk from the southern monasteries who had experience with soul sickness. But Lord Regan, the king's brother and royal advisor, had overridden him. "The girl is dead," he had barked. "And the kingdom needs closure." What no one dared say aloud was this. Regan had always disliked Elira. She was not his daughter. She was a symbol of a queen he resented, and a bloodline he could never claim. Her absence from court meant one less barrier between him and power. When Edric tried to press the matter further, he was quietly dismissed. His chambers were sealed. He was escorted to a countryside estate for rest. The physician never returned. A door that should have been sealed. 3 weeks after Elira's funeral, a palace worker named Jorn went missing. He was a carpenter's apprentice assigned to work in the lower halls, refurbishing the humidity-damaged crypt doors. It was supposed to be a simple 2-day task. But Jorn never came back. His tools were found neatly arranged outside the royal tomb. And one of the doors, the one leading to Elira's chamber, was slightly ajar. This detail was never shared publicly. In fact, the king himself never heard of it. Lord Regan ensured that. Instead, the crypt was locked entirely. Access was revoked to all staff. A new guard post was established at the entrance, and anyone asking questions was warned under threat of treasonous suspicion. The message was clear: let the dead lie silent. But the dead, it seemed, were not silent. Queen Verrell's descent. In her private quarters, Queen Verrell began to deteriorate. She no longer dined with the king. No longer wrote to foreign allies. Her eyes, once sharp with royal intellect, had grown distant. She spoke to portraits. She wandered the halls at night. And one evening she was found asleep outside the crypt, barefoot, whispering her daughter's name into the cracks of the sealed stone. The royal clergy declared it grief-induced madness. But a few close to her believed something else. "She knows," whispered Meryl, her handmaiden. "She feels her daughter's pain." And there were signs. A small mirror in the queen's chamber cracked down the middle without reason. Her jewelry box opened by itself. And one day, when servants cleaned her room, they found a folded paper under her pillow with a single line. "Mother, I'm not dead." It was written in Eliza's handwriting. The king was never told. The portrait that wept. What finally shook the palace to its core wasn't a scream. It wasn't a sound. It was a painting. Princess Eliza's official court portrait, an oil masterpiece hanging in the royal atrium, was discovered altered one morning. Not destroyed. Altered. Someone had redrawn her eyes. They were now open, staring straight ahead, wide and afraid. And faint streaks of dried red, resembling blood, ran down her cheeks like tears. Guards were summoned. Painters were questioned. But no one had touched it. There had been no break-in. No defacement. The paints had not been recently applied. They had appeared. The portrait was immediately taken down and hidden in the royal vaults. But the damage had been done. Servants refused to enter the atrium at night. The whispers returned. And this time even the guards listened. Was the princess truly dead? Or had the kingdom buried a child, alive? The corridors of the palace had grown quieter since the young girl's disappearance. Once echoing with the vibrant laughter and hurried footsteps of court life, they now carried only whispers, tense, suspicious, trembling with guilt. Every creaking floorboard and flickering candle became an omen, a reminder of what had happened beneath the very stones they walked upon. Behind thick wooden doors, the council of advisors debated restlessly. King Elderic sat at the head of a long table, but his once unshakable authority was cracking. His fingers trembled slightly as he clutched his goblet, filled now with stronger drink than wine. The weight of guilt had pressed into him like the cold edge of a blade. The courtiers believed the girl was gone, vanished like a ghost. But the queen was not convinced. Queen Isolde had noticed the signs before anyone else. The locked journal, the sudden change in her daughter's temperament, the way the servants spoke in hushed voices and quickly bowed away. She had not been told of the burial. That decision was made in her absence, when she had taken ill for several days and was too weak to attend court. When she returned, her daughter was gone. They told her it had been fever, that it took her swiftly. They told her the child had suffered and passed in her sleep. But Queen Isolde did not believe in soft deaths within a royal court. She knew too well the things that could be hidden behind closed doors. So she began asking questions. First the maids, then the royal physician. Then finally she confronted Elderic. Their confrontation was not public, nor was it loud, but it was sharp, like a dagger slid between ribs. "You lied to me," she whispered in the candlelight of their chamber, eyes glistening with the rage of a grieving mother. "You let them bury my daughter without me." The king's answer was silence. He looked at the floor. That was enough. From that moment on, Queen Isolde stopped speaking at court altogether. Her silks turned to black velvet. Her hair was always tied, severe and clean, as though mourning required discipline. She began keeping her own records, speaking with servants under the guise of kindness, pressing coins into the hands of stable boys and kitchen girls in exchange for tiny truths. It wasn't long before one of the younger maids came forward, trembling like a leaf in the autumn wind. "I heard her scream," she said, "that night. I thought I imagined it, my lady. It was only once, but it was a scream, like someone trapped." Isolde's heart clenched. She did not blink. She did not weep. She simply nodded once and dismissed the girl. That night, the queen made her way, cloaked and hooded, toward the royal cemetery on the outskirts of the palace grounds. She carried nothing but a small lantern and a key that unlocked the mausoleum. The moon was half hidden behind slow-moving clouds. The trees stood as silent witnesses. Isolde's breath formed clouds in the cold air as she descended the stone steps into the burial vault. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of old stone, burnt candles and decay. She found the coffin. unmarked, brush, tucked away in the darkest corner as if someone had tried to forget. The queen placed her hand on the lid. Her rings tapped softly on the wood, and she listened. Silence. Only her own breath and the slow beat of her heart. She did not open it that night. She would not dare, not without proof. But from that moment on, the queen had a purpose. A terrible holy mission. She would uncover the truth, no matter who it destroyed. In the hushed chambers of the royal court, where candlelight flickered against ancient stone walls and every whisper was weighed like gold, the story of young Isabel's resurrection had become more than just gossip. It had grown into something far more dangerous, a symbol. As the French countryside reeled from the tale of a child clawing her way back from the grave, nobles and commoners alike began to wonder what else might be hidden beneath the gilded facade of monarchy and divine rule. Isabel, the girl who should have died, now embodied a quiet but growing defiance. The tale had reached the ears of Queen Blanche, who, behind her icy poise, felt the tremors of unease. Monarchs and popes feared chaos not born of rebellion, but of faith twisted into confusion. Cardinal de Savoy, ever the political animal, urged decisive action. "This child," he hissed, "is a threat to the sanctity of the throne. Her survival is a miracle, or a curse. Either way, the people are watching. And when people watch, they begin to question." King Charles, weary from the burdens of rule and still reeling from the shadow of his father's reign, struggled to weigh the spiritual implications against the political cost. For to silence a girl declared saved by God would be to challenge heaven itself, yet to let her live freely might embolden the silent rebellion stirring in the fields and city squares. Elsewhere in the court, Isabel had become a whispered obsession. Courtiers speculated endlessly: had she seen angels or demons? Was her return a divine sign or a sinister omen? Poets penned verses in secret. Artists sketched angelic renditions of a girl they had never seen. But no one had spoken to her. Isabel was held in a gilded confinement, her every move watched by silent guards and discreet attendants. She was dressed in royal silks and fed honeyed figs, but the air smelled like fear. They called it protection. She called it a new kind of grave. One winter morning, as snow blanketed the palace gardens in ghostly white, a visitor was announced to the queen's private chamber, Father Remy. He was a plain man, neither as scholarly nor as politically sharp as the cardinals. But he had met Isabel, truly met her, and saw not a threat but a child still healing. "Your Majesty," he began softly, bowing low, "you are being lied to." The queen's narrowed eyes did not blink. Lied to? They call her a symbol. An omen. But Isabel is no symbol. She is a child who was buried alive by error and survived by strength. What the people believe is born of fear, not faith. She does not need to be hidden, she needs to be heard. Blanche studied him, unmoved. "And what would you suggest? That we parade her before the masses as if she were the Virgin reborn?" "No," Remy said. "Let her speak. The truth, not the myth. If she is silenced, she becomes legend. If she speaks, she becomes human." That night, Queen Blanche summoned Isabel. The child entered slowly, her steps cautious across the marble floor. The queen dismissed the guards. For a moment they stood in silence, an aging monarch and a fragile girl wrapped in velvet. "They say you returned from death," Blanche said. "Do you remember it?" Isabel looked down. "I remember darkness, an air that would not come. I remember screaming where no one heard. But I did not die. I slept. I dreamed. I waited. And I clawed." Her voice, soft but clear, rang like a bell in the vast chamber. "And when they found you? I thought I was still dreaming." The queen regarded her for a long time. This was no angel, no witch, just a girl haunted but alive. "You will speak," Blanche finally said. "Not to the court, not to the clergy, but to the people. Quietly, without pageantry. They must see that you are real, not a prophecy." Isabel nodded. And thus began the second resurrection of the girl buried alive, not from death but from myth. The temple stood silent under the veil of early dawn. Mist curled around its broken spires like ghostly tendrils. The stone figures along its gates, once majestic guardians of a bygone kingdom, now bore only the wear of centuries, noses chipped, eyes eroded by rain and time. But today the silence wasn't just the hush of history. It was a waiting silence, the kind that lingers before something awakens. Inside the sanctum, the smell of charred incense clung to the air. A single torch flickered to life in the hand of Darius, not a priest nor a scholar, but a gravedigger turned guide, who had seen too much and trusted too little. He had returned to the temple not out of belief but out of necessity. Behind him walked Elin, the historian whose obsession had brought them here. Her eyes weren't on the path, they were tracing the glyphs that lined the temple's interior. Stories of gods punishing kings, of buried sinners clawing back to the surface, of entire cities disappearing into the ground as penance. "This is it," she whispered, half in awe, half in dread. The burial wasn't just metaphorical. They didn't just hide the truth, they entombed it. Darius scoffed. People say a lot of things when they want to scare you away from treasure. But even he had to admit, the air was wrong. Too cold. Too still. As if the temple itself held its breath. They descended deeper into the catacombs beneath the altar. Narrow corridors opened to subterranean chambers where forgotten rituals were once performed. Symbols on the walls became more frantic, more violent. Eyes carved in every corner. Eyes watching. Then came the room. A circular chamber, sealed behind a slab of obsidian. Elin traced her fingers along its edges. "It's not a door," she said. "It's a warning. Look." There, etched crudely with what looked like bone or claw, were words in a dead dialect. Whoever unseals the silence becomes its voice. But it was already too late. Darius, impatient, had wedged his blade into the seam and cracked the slab open with a grunt. And the darkness behind it didn't feel empty, it moved. Meanwhile, miles away, Colonel Vishran wiped the dust off his spectacles. The local authorities had been breathing down his neck since the disappearances began, but even his years of skeptical service couldn't explain what they'd found. Birds that had dropped dead mid-air, villagers wandering aimlessly with dirt under their nails and eyes vacant as if sleepwalking from nightmares they could not wake from. He stared at the satellite images. There, behind the mountain ridge just beyond the range of the local GPS signals, a black hole. Not metaphorical. A literal one. A point where data, signal, even heat signatures, ceased to exist. And it was expanding. He dialed the radio. "Deploy drones to Quadrant 4C. Don't go near it. Just observe. Tell them we may be dealing with something ancient. Pre-human." Back in the temple. When the slab fell open, it didn't crash, it whispered. A sigh of relief from something that had been asleep too long. Inside was a burial site. But not just one. Rows of bodies stacked like archives, their skin mummified yet wet to the touch. Eyes sealed with wax. Mouths sewn shut. Elin stumbled back, gasping. This isn't a tomb. It's a prison. Each body had been bound in a ritual circle. Some still had iron nails piercing their feet, symbols of suppression. Silencing. Caging something within them, not just the person themselves. And then she saw it. The central slab. A figure buried face down with chains of stone and bone. Its spine had symbols etched directly into the vertebrae, sigils that pulsed faintly as if reacting to her presence. Darius moved toward it, curiosity overcoming caution. "Stop," she shouted. "It's not dead." But the moment was gone. His hand grazed the slab. The silence shattered. The torches all went out. In a heartbeat, everything was still, until the ground began to moan. A low, guttural tremor that echoed inside the skull like a second heartbeat. The body on the slab convulsed. Darius fell back, his eyes wide. I didn't do anything." The figure sat up. Not human. Not fully. Its face was blank, like skin had grown over where its features had once been. And yet it looked at them. Elin couldn't move. Her legs refused. Her mind, screaming to run, instead whispered, "He was buried alive, for eternity." The creature's chest heaved. Then, with a horrifying crack, its jaw snapped open despite the wax. A single word spilled out in a voice that did not belong in this century. Silence. The corpses in the room began to twitch. One by one, they rose. Meanwhile, the surface trembles. Colonel Vishran's team watched in horror as the drone feed turned to static. Before it cut out, they saw it, the ground around the temple, breathing, pulsing like a living organ, and rising. "Evacuate the zone," he commanded. "This isn't archaeology. This is containment." Inside, a fight for memory. Elin grabbed a torch and swung it at the creature. The flame singed its waxen face, but it didn't flinch. It only turned and whispered again. The catacomb walls responded. Stone began to melt. Glyphs crawled across surfaces like veins. Darius found a scroll dropped in the debris. It wasn't a spell, it was a journal. "Listen to this," he yelled over the howling wind. The people didn't fear him because he was evil. They feared him because he remembered. He remembered what they buried. Elin understood. They weren't just trying to erase a man, they were trying to erase what he knew. A truth too dangerous, too painful. And now it was clawing back into the world. They had to stop it, not by destroying it but by containing the memory once more. Elin began chanting the only line repeated across all glyphs. Bind the voice. Bury the truth. Silence the past. The room shook violently. Bodies collapsed. The creature howled and the catacombs began to fall. With one final push, Elin threw herself against the slab, dragging the chains back over the figure's chest. The stone folded in on itself. Then, silence. The once proud silence of the palace halls now echoed with uncertainty. Not even the grand marble pillars or the royal banners, fluttering like lost prayers in the wind, could mask the tension growing with each passing moment. A storm was brewing, not in the skies but within the minds of men who held power, and those who dared to question it. The trial had begun. Not a trial in the way justice is celebrated today, but a performance, a dance of influence where verdicts were written long before words were ever spoken. It was held in the Grand Chamber, once a place of unity and policy, now dimmed by veiled distrust and veiled ambition. Lord Mehran stood as the accused, though no formal crime had been presented. He was flanked not by guards but by silence, far more threatening. His presence unnerved those who had once admired him. His intellect had built bridges, won wars and healed old tribal wounds. But that same intellect now threatened the king's unchecked will. That made him dangerous. Across from him sat the High Council, an assemblage of silver-haired elders, chosen less for their wisdom and more for their loyalty. Behind them stood the king's newly formed enforcers, the Black Mantle Order, cloaked in secrecy and bred for fear. These were not the old guards who had protected kings with honor. They were a new breed of shadow, taught to obey without question, to protect the throne at all costs, even from truth. The king himself did not attend. He rarely did anymore. Instead, his will was spoken through his mouthpiece, Lady Serene, the court inquisitor. Once a respected scholar of law, she had turned into something else entirely, a weapon forged from ink, scrolls, and manipulation. She began, "Lord Mehran, you stand accused not of treason by blade but by thought. Ideas, after all, can be sharper than swords." A hush swept through the chamber. Everyone knew what this meant. The regime no longer feared rebels who raised arms, but those who dared to dream of another way. Mehran's voice was steady, even in isolation. "Then it is not I who should be on trial. It is the very spirit of this kingdom." His words stirred something ancient in the room, something almost forgotten. But the council did not move. They were statues carved by fear, not faith. Lady Serene continued with poetic venom. She listed his crimes, correspondence with foreign thinkers, gathering books banned by royal decree, and worst of all, hosting private salons where men and women spoke without permission, without surveillance. Mehran never denied these. "Yes," he said. "Because if truth is treason, then this land has lost more than I can betray." Outside the palace walls, word of the trial had spread. The people, those same villagers and merchants whose lives Mehran had bettered, began gathering. Not in protest, not yet, but in quiet presence. Watching. Waiting. Among them stood a girl, no more than 17, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. Her name was Eliza, the daughter of a bookbinder and one of Mehran's students. She had learned not just to read but to think. And thinking in this new age was its own form of defiance. Inside, the council was reaching its conclusion. They would not execute Mehran, not yet. They needed a public display, something that would shame without making him a martyr. And so they sentenced him to exile, not across the border but to the Isle of Whispers. A place where rebels were sent to be forgotten. A place where silence was forced upon even the wind. The verdict was met with a cold, strategic applause. But outside the people did not clap. They stood still. Eyes locked. Hearts awakened. As Mayron was escorted through the gates, his hands unbound, he passed by Eliza. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment no words were needed. A torch had passed. The king thought he had removed a threat. But what he didn't realize was that Mayron's greatest power had already been unleashed. The awakening of a generation who had seen justice distorted and now hungered for its restoration. The shadows had won a battle. But the fire had only just begun. The once proud silence of the palace halls now echoed with uncertainty. Not even the grand marble pillars or the royal banners, fluttering like lost prayers in the wind, could mask the tension growing with each passing moment. A storm was brewing, not in the skies but within the minds of men who held power, and those who dared to question it. The trial had begun. Not a trial in the way justice is celebrated today, but a performance, a dance of influence where verdicts were written long before words were ever spoken. It was held in the Grand Chamber, once a place of unity and policy, now dimmed by veiled distrust and veiled ambition. Lord Mayron stood as the accused, though no formal crime had been presented. He was flanked not by guards but by silence, far more threatening. His presence unnerved those who had once admired him. His intellect had built bridges, won wars and healed old tribal wounds. But that same intellect now threatened the king's unchecked will. That made him dangerous. Across from him sat the High Council, an assemblage of silver-haired elders, chosen less for their wisdom and more for their loyalty. Behind them stood the king's newly formed enforcers, the Black Mantle Order, cloaked in secrecy and bred for fear. These were not the old guards who had protected kings with honor. They were a new breed of shadow, taught to obey without question, to protect the throne at all costs, even from truth. The king himself did not attend. He rarely did anymore. Instead, his will was spoken through his mouthpiece, Lady Serene, the court inquisitor. Once a respected scholar of law, she had turned into something else entirely, a weapon forged from ink, scrolls, and manipulation. She began, "Lord Mayron, you stand accused not of treason by blade but by thought. Ideas, after all, can be sharper than swords." A hush swept through the chamber. Everyone knew what this meant. The regime no longer feared rebels who raised arms, but those who dared to dream of another way. Mayron's voice was steady, even in isolation. "Then it is not I who should be on trial. It is the very spirit of this kingdom." His words stirred something ancient in the room, something almost forgotten. But the council did not move. They were statues carved by fear, not faith. Lady Serene continued with poetic venom. She listed his crimes, correspondence with foreign thinkers, gathering books banned by royal decree, and worst of all, hosting private salons where men and women spoke without permission, without surveillance. Mayron never denied these. "Yes," he said. "Because if truth is treason, then this land has lost more than I can betray." Outside the palace walls, word of the trial had spread. The people, those same villagers and merchants whose lives Mayron had bettered, began gathering. Not in protest, not yet, but in quiet presence. Watching. Waiting. Among them stood a girl, no more than 17, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders. Her name was Eliza, the daughter of a bookbinder and one of Mayron's students. She had learned not just to read but to think. And thinking, in this new age, was its own form of defiance. Inside, the council was reaching its conclusion. They would not execute Mayron, not yet. They needed a public display, something that would shame without making him a martyr. And so they sentenced him to exile, not across the border but to the Isle of Whispers. A place where rebels were sent to be forgotten. A place where silence was forced upon even the wind. The verdict was met with a cold, strategic applause. But outside the people did not clap. They stood still. Eyes locked. Hearts awakened. As Mayron was escorted through the gates, his hands unbound, he passed by Eliza. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that moment no words were needed. A torch had passed. The king thought he had removed a threat. But what he didn't realize was that Mayron's greatest power had already been unleashed. the awakening of a generation who had seen justice distorted and now hungered for its restoration. The shadows had won a battle, but the fire had only just begun. The story of Abelard and Heloise, a love that burned through time. In 12th century Paris, Peter Abelard was not just a man of words, he was the word, a philosopher, a scholar, a poet. His lectures were famous, his logic admired across Europe. But beneath that intellect, a fire smoldered, and it found its match in a woman whose intellect could rival his, Heloise. She was young, yes, but she wasn't just a pretty face in a convent. Heloise had studied Latin, Greek, even Hebrew. Her mind was a force, her spirit defiant. She didn't want marriage. She didn't want the cage society offered. What she wanted was freedom. And Abelard? He was the spark. He became her tutor. And soon their lessons became letters. Letters became kisses. Kisses became stolen nights under candlelight. But Paris is not kind to secret love. Especially not when the woman is a niece of a powerful church official, Canon Fulbert. The scandal that followed wasn't just whispered in corridors, it exploded. When Heloise became pregnant, Abelard smuggled her away to Brittany and named their son Astrolabe. He tried to make things right by offering marriage. But Heloise, strong, bold Heloise, refused. "Marriage will ruin you," she said. "It will bury your career. And I won't be your downfall." But pressure mounted. They married in secret. It didn't stay secret long. Fulbert, humiliated and enraged, sought brutal revenge. One night, Fulbert's men broke into Abelard's chambers. And there, under the cloak of darkness, they mutilated him. Castration. A punishment so final it shattered more than flesh, it broke futures. Abelard took refuge in a monastery. Heloise was forced into a convent. Two lovers torn apart. Not by choice. Not by betrayal. But by the crushing weight of society's shame. And yet, they never stopped writing. Their letters, raw with emotion and aching with memory, have survived for centuries. In them you don't find fairy tale endings. You find the truth. "God is my witness, I never sought anything in you except yourself. I desired you only." They lived apart. But their souls never separated. The passion of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II. When love turns to war. Eleanor of Aquitaine was no ordinary woman. She was a queen twice. First of France, then of England, and in between, a force of nature. When she married Henry II of England in 1152, the match seemed perfect. She was fiery, ambitious, and politically sharp. He was a rising monarch with restless energy. Together they ruled more of France than the French king himself. They had 8 children, including future kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. But don't be fooled by the royal titles. Their marriage was less a union, and more a battleground. At first there was love, undeniable, scorching love. They wrote to each other, gifted jewels, whispered secrets over long rides through the Loire Valley. But as years passed, passion turned to power struggles. Henry grew colder, more controlling. He took mistresses. One of them, Rosamund Clifford, was called the Fair Rosamund, a beauty hidden in a secret garden that Eleanor was rumored to have discovered. Legends say she offered Rosamund 2 choices, dagger or poison. History never confirmed the tale. But it didn't need to. The rift between them deepened. Eleanor began to plot. In 1173 she did the unthinkable. She supported her sons in a rebellion against their father. A queen, rebelling against her king. Henry crushed the uprising. And Eleanor? He locked her away. For 16 years. Not in chains, but behind castle walls. A queen in exile. A wife in silence. Yet when Henry died, it was Eleanor who walked free. And it was she who would guide Richard the Lionheart to the throne. Her legacy didn't end in heartbreak. It transformed into power. Tristan and Isolde, the romance that inspired centuries of tragedy. While some love stories were lived, others were whispered, retold, reshaped, like the legendary tale of Tristan and Isolde. It is hard to separate fact from fiction here. But the heart of the tale is deeply medieval and achingly human. Tristan, a knight of noble blood, is sent to Ireland to bring back Princess Isolde to marry his uncle, King Mark of Cornwall. But fate, tricky cruel fate, intervenes. On the journey back, Tristan and Isolde accidentally drink a love potion. Some say it was meant for the wedding night. Others say it was the work of witches. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. They fall helplessly, hopelessly in love. But Isolde must still marry King Mark. She becomes queen. Tristan becomes knight. And their secret affair burns beneath the veil of duty. They meet in forests, in hidden chambers, in the silence of moonlight. Each meeting risks death. Each stolen moment adds fuel to the fire. Eventually they are discovered. Depending on the version, they flee, or they are punished, or they die in separate lands, broken and alone. But one version haunts more than others, that Tristan is fatally wounded in battle and he sends for Isolde. But she arrives too late. When she sees his lifeless body, she collapses, dies, and the two are buried side by side. From their graves, two trees grow and intertwine, a love that defied death, but not destiny. The eternal thread of these stories. What binds these stories? Not just love, but resistance. Heloise resisted marriage to preserve love's purity. Eleanor resisted betrayal to reclaim power. Tristan and Isolde resisted royalty to honor passion. These were not passive lovers. They were fighters, rebels, victims and victors of a world that feared the wildness of the heart. History likes to place them in margins, as scandals, as tragedies. But maybe they were revolutions. They say love is eternal. But stories are what make it unforgettable. Though the flickering candlelight of medieval courts has long since been snuffed out, the echo of those whispered vows, secret glances, and tragic farewells still lingers, not just in dusty manuscripts and ancient tapestries, but in our everyday imaginations. The legacy of medieval romance is not just preserved in history books. It breathes within the very fabric of modern storytelling, fashion, wedding customs, and even language. From novels to movies, music to memes, the courtly ideals of love that once enchanted lords and ladies now enchant us all. But how did these centuries-old ideas about love survive in an era of swipes, emojis, and instant messages? Let us peel back the layers. From troubadours to TikTok. It began with words, carefully chosen, rhythmically sung. In the Middle Ages, troubadours and minstrels traveled across kingdoms, performing verses of unrequited love, noble sacrifice, and painful longing. Their ballads often featured brave knights willing to die for a lady's smile, or noble women who pined for love in silence behind castle walls. These weren't just songs. They were emotional instruction manuals. They taught people how to feel, how to yearn, how to idealize love not just as passion, but as a moral quest. Fast forward 800 years, and those poetic echoes are still with us. Modern love songs may be backed by synthesizers and bass beats, but the themes haven't changed. Whether it's Adele singing about heartbreak or Taylor Swift romanticizing a love story under moonlight, we are still leaning on the same script. Even on platforms like TikTok, the language of love borrows from chivalric traditions. Think about it. Grand gestures, long-distance longing, the idea of the one. These are not new. They are medieval ideals modernized. Hollywood and the chivalric template. Every time we watch a romantic drama where a poor but honest hero wins the heart of a highborn girl, we are watching a replay of medieval courtly love. Think of The Princess Bride, Ever After, A Knight's Tale, or even Bridgerton. All of them owe a creative debt to medieval narratives of romance. Even Disney's fairy tales, with their enchanted forests, cursed lovers, and noble sacrifices, are just polished versions of ancient legends. Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, and Cinderella each echo the themes of chastity, longing, transformation, and reward found in troubadour songs and Arthurian tales. The very idea of true love conquers all. It wasn't born in Hollywood. It was carved in stone by poets like Crétin de Troyes, and whispered through centuries of retellings. Weddings, a medieval blueprint. Have you ever wondered why brides wear white? Or why we exchange rings? These customs may seem timeless, but their roots are tangled with medieval rituals. The white dress symbolizes purity, a value deeply emphasized in courtly love, where the ideal woman was often untouchable, innocent, and ethereal. Rings, too, were symbols of eternal fidelity, used in Christian and pagan rituals alike during the medieval period. Even the concept of a knight in shining armor, saving a damsel in distress, it's the blueprint of modern wedding storytelling. Grooms are expected to make grand proposals, and brides are encouraged to dream of fairy tale ceremonies. Our modern idea of a perfect wedding is not just a social event, it's a reenactment of a medieval fantasy. Romantic language, medieval echoes in our words. Think of words like crush, heartache, sweetheart, infatuation, or courting. These aren't inventions of the digital age. They were once spoken in candlelit chambers, written in love letters sealed with wax and heartbreak. The phrase, wearing your heart on your sleeve, originated from jousting tournaments where knights wore tokens, sometimes even a lady's handkerchief or scarf, tied to their armor. Lovesick was a diagnosable condition in medieval medical texts. Monks and physicians genuinely believed that longing could cause illness, fevers, and even death. In today's language, we might call it anxiety or depression, but the sentiment remains eerily similar. And let's not forget Shakespeare, whose plays bridged the gap between medieval courtly ideals and Renaissance emotional realism. His characters fall in love foolishly, desperately, and tragically, just like the ones centuries before him. Medieval archetypes in pop culture. Look closer at the roles we idolize today in fiction. The brooding male hero with a tragic past, Batman, Edward Cullen, The Witcher. He is the modern knight. The clever, resilient female who longs for freedom and love, Katniss Everdeen, Elizabeth Bennet, Daenerys Targaryen. She is the courtly lady reimagined. The formulas still work because our emotional architecture hasn't changed. We still crave devotion. We still admire sacrifice. We still believe in the transformative power of love. Even in an age where love can be found with a swipe, we still dream of something more. Something epic. Why does medieval love still haunt us? Because it wasn't just about love. It was about purpose. Medieval lovers often saw their emotions as divine missions. To love truly was to grow morally. To suffer in silence was to prove one's worth. Love wasn't easy, it was sacred. And maybe that's what still draws us in. We want love to mean something. We want it to be rare, difficult, and worth everything. The medieval ideal may be wrapped in fantasy, but it reflects a universal hunger. Not just to be wanted, but to be worthy of desire. So ashes of time, embers of romance. We live in a world powered by technology, distracted by screens, and flooded with data. And yet, we keep circling back to old tales. Why? Because beneath the noise, we still want the quiet power of a look across a room. A letter penned in hope. A story that outlives us. The medieval world is gone, but its emotions remain immortal. And in that, perhaps, lies its greatest romance of all.